You want me to start? Who's starting?
You, Senate. We always go with the Senate first. You know,
Oh,
I know my place, Mike.
yeah. Well, welcome everyone. My name's Mike Fanning. I'm in the Senate. I used to teach high school social studies. And when I taught social studies back in the 80s, we taught about communism. And I remember teaching about how America's democracy is so far better than the communistic empire of Asia that they would hold elections and they would pretend like they were the democracy we were, but it was a mocracy. It was only one candidate was on the ballot, and so you looked like you had an election. But back in those days of the evil empire of communism, they would hold fake elections because there was only one name in the ballot. We celebrated that in America, people had choices. People could pick citizens that represented them in a representative democracy. We now see what a mockery we have. That as a high school history teacher that loved democracy and enjoyed teaching the benefits of democracy compared to others. Today we see in South Carolina, 71% of South Carolinians have the same choice that communist citizens had 40 years ago because they only have one choice on the ballot. We now know that only 14% of the people are involved in picking and electing our leaders because the majority of the elections are decided in the primary because we've created this system has created safe Republican seats, safe Democrat seats. We've done this through packing minorities into districts or gerrymandering. But the biggest thing is the system can't fix itself because the system has us elected officials deciding where the boundaries are, which means we're picking the voters, which makes us no better than the countries we made fun of back in the 80s. And so the reason that Representative Gilda Cobb-Hunter and I introduced the FAIR Act, we previously introduced citizens panels that would draw the lines for us. But more importantly, the FAIR Act is that South Carolina needs to change the system. We can no longer sit back and keep a system in place that for decades has a game in place with no rules, with the politicians getting to decide what voters that we have and what voters that we want in our district voting for us. No rules in place legally. We have committees that might have rules, but there's no rules set aside in law. And so Representative Cobb-Hunter and I introduced the FAIR Act to try to say at least we need to put our rules into law so that there's some kind of transparency with the public so that they can see what the process is. Because if we give the citizens a glimpse at the process that's going on right now, they'll see that we are the emperor with no clothes.
On that note, Mike, if I could just jump in, let me start by thanking all of you for being on the call. Really, Senator Fanning and I really appreciate your interest in this, and it is quite timely. The Senate has already done its hearings. The House hearings will start tonight. There are a couple of points that we think are important that you should be aware of. Some of you may be, and some of you may not be. South Carolina is the only state in the union that does not have legislation or actual legislation that governs how we redistrict, the redistricting process here in South Carolina. What that means is while the process has been gerrymandered around the country, and we are all familiar with that, it is even more egregious here in South Carolina because there are no rules that are in statute that the General Assembly is bound to live by. We have seen here in this latest round, on the House side, for example, a change in how the committees have been established. In the past, the Election Law Subcommittee and the House Judiciary Committee drew lines. They prepared the maps, they presented them to the Judiciary Committee. The Judiciary Committee voted on them up or down and then presented them to the entire House. For the first time in almost 30 years that I have served in the South Carolina General Assembly, the process was changed this year. A special committee was created, not the Election Law Subcommittee. And the thing that is interesting to me about this special committee, that is being charged with what is probably the most important piece of legislation to come down the pike. The issue for me is that very few, if any of them, have any experience in the redistricting process. Now, that may be coincidental. The change from precedent of having the election law subcommittee may also be coincidental. I don't think it is. So we need not just legislators, but we need the public to have clarity on how this entire process is going to work. As Mike pointed out, we've introduced legislation, and let me be very clear. We have absolutely no expectation that this legislation is going to pass, because what we're proposing, quite frankly, is revolutionary here in South Carolina. What we are proposing is that people pick the politician rather than the politician pick the people. What our legislation does is allow that to happen. And let me add, before I turn it back over to Senator Fanning, let me add that we didn't just pull this out of thin air. In 2017, the Progressive Network commissioned a study surveying South Carolinians all across this state. And the results of that survey, although it's almost 4 years old, the results we think are still pretty much with what today's sentiments are, probably even more. Back in 2017, when that survey was done, 67% of South Carolinians thought that people ought to pick politicians, that we needed to end this process. And so what we are trying to do is bring attention to the fact that, yet again, South Carolina is solo, unique in a capacity that is not necessarily good. We think that the people ought to pick the politicians and not the other way around. And the other thing I would just leave you with is that what we see here in South Carolina is the result of what happens when there are not competitive elections. Here in our state, the person who is going to serve in the House or the Senate is usually determined by the primary. There are very few, if any, competitive races in November. From our perspective, democracy suffers when that is the case. We need to do something about this, and the time for doing it has passed. Thanks for being here, and I look forward to your questions. Hello, Brett, Mike, you want to?
Well, I'll jump in. I was going to see if anybody had any questions, but just two things. Is Representative Cobb-Hunter really hit the reasons why we've introduced this and what our hope is. And it's really simple, is that, and the people have said that in the survey, is the involvement of the people in the process. Right now, the process is exclusively done by the elected officials. Representative Cobb-Hunter and I, 2 years ago, introduced a bill that would turn that over to citizen review panels to draw the district lines. And people said, well, wouldn't you be worried about it? That I can feel with complete assurance is if my biggest opponents in the world were in charge of drawing the lines, they couldn't be any more gerrymandered than we have in South Carolina now, because the survey shows that that citizens, whether they want to lean Republican or Democrat, they believe in a fair election. They believe in people having a choice. I have one of the few competitive races in the Senate. Every election I've run so far has been between 1 and 3 percentage points. If you look at the demographics in Fairfield, York, and Chester counties, you'll see it's a very balanced district. And that has benefited me because I have to answer to both Republicans and Democrats. Republicans and Democrats both know they can hold me accountable. And that is healthy for me. I don't have lots of the ability to work with my colleagues in that way, because many of my colleagues are either in safe Republican seats or safer Democratic seats, and they aren't as tied to having to answer to folks from both sides of the aisle. So involving the people to make sure lines are drawn so that we have elections that give the people choices. Republicans and Democrats want that. And Representative Cobb-Hunter mentioned the bill won't pass. And it's true, we're out of session, so we know the bill won't pass before this happens. But why did we do it? Is that we want to shine a light.
Right.
Transparency is so important. No one is talking about the fact that South Carolina has no laws governing our process. So if citizens aren't in charge of it, like in other states, if politicians are in charge of it, at least we ought to have laws that the public can look at and make sure they're holding us accountable for following those legal guidelines for drawing those lines.
And here's one other thing that I neglected to mention. And when we talk about legal guidelines, when we talk about laws, what we should also remember is that this is the very first redistricting effort that will occur post gutting of the Voting Rights Act. In 2013, as many of you are aware, the Supreme Court pretty much gutted Section 5, which is pre-clearance of the Voting Rights Act. So the state of South Carolina does not have to worry about submitting its plans to the Justice Department for pre-clearance. That has been the process for as long as I've been in the legislature, and we are missing that. There are still some Section 2 issues that we may or may not be able to avail ourselves of, but that's based on potential litigation. And quite frankly, for those of us who have been around for a minute, when we think about remedies and when we think about the courts, we all recognize that the playing field has changed, that we have a Supreme Court that is not necessarily, shall we say, friendly to issues of redistricting that don't involve gerrymandering. And quite frankly, the bottom line for all of this for me is that we have gotten to a place, not just in South Carolina, but in this country where power rules. And power is all that is important. And what we know here in South Carolina is that when you have power and you don't have transparency and accountability, then you are looking at opportunities for corruption. We've seen that for several years, through the past 30 years at least. And so we just think that it's time for us to do something about this. And just on a personal note, I don't want to be unprofessional, but I do want to say a shout out to Meg Kynard. I see her on here, and it is good to see her. You look gorgeous, Meg. Good to see you.
Representative Cobb-Hunter, if I may do a little housekeeping
Sure.
here. What's on the screen now is the fairmapssc.com homepage that has all you need to know and more than you want to know about the circumstances and the solution. And as Cobb-Hunter pointed out, this is not a utopian vision that we expect all the politicians to support. The reason they won't support it is the reason we have this vision to get around them with a ground game. So the ground game is explained here. And also you can go to the homepage and scroll down and see the points, your talking points that you would want to raise if you go to one of the House meetings that are coming up. The first one is tonight in Myrtle Beach. And that everybody that signed up will send a link to the recording. So if you wanted to capture some of the brilliance of Cobb-Hunter and Senator Fanning, it will be right there in your inbox coming soon. Thank you, Gilda. Thank you, Mike.
Any questions for me or Senator Fanning?
Hey, this is Joseph over at the state newspaper. Does your legislation include anything about like an independent commission, the idea of an independent commission drawing the lines?
Yes, we have filed separate legislation that creates an independent commission. And Joe, what's interesting about our legislation as compared to independent commissions in other states is that there is a governor there is language in the legislation which will not allow for interference by legislators, by the executive branch. No one who is related to a legislator or affiliated with the executive branch can even serve on the redistricting commission. So yes, we have two separate pieces, and one involves creating an independent commission to draw lines.
So this is Shauna. By the time the legislators could take up this legislation, even if they wanted to, the lines for this process should be almost done, if not already done. So is this more about education or perhaps looking toward the next process?
This
I
is
think it's
about,
both. Go ahead. I'm sorry, Senator.
if I can, yeah, this is about shining light. Is that Shauna, you've seen that I have been on the losing ends of several legislative fights in the past, and so when you don't have the votes, you still have to shine the light on something. And Representative Cobb-Hunter and I don't want the public to become engaged after the maps are already drawn and after it's adopted. Is that the bill, this specific legislation, shines the light that we don't have anything in the code of laws that govern the process that we're about to do. And by shining that light, we're hoping to increase participation in these meetings that are occurring beginning in the House tonight. The Senate will hold their second round of these public hearings in about a month. We want, since we don't have the laws in place, and we should have the laws in place, and we want to offer a solution, in the meantime, we at least want the folks from both sides of the aisle, Republicans and Democrats and independents, to get angry and to know that they're the only ones that can show up and hold ourselves accountable, demanding to know what are those rules that are going to be followed. Tell us now. Don't tell us once the maps are drawn, here's the rules that we followed to justify what we've done, but to tell us up front, what rules are you going to follow? So when we do get to see the maps, we can see, yes, they followed those rules, or no, they didn't.
Well, and Shauna, quite frankly, we don't know when maps will be drawn, presented, voted on, adopted by the House. There is no set timeline. We've been told, initially we were told, well, we're going to do it in September when we come back. We're now hearing, well, we're just going to deal with the money perhaps in September, and we will start drawing, we'll deal with redistricting in October. My point is that's the point of the legislation. If there was a legislation in place that said, this is the timeline for starting the process, this is when all of this happens. And of course, we have not mentioned, but added to this chaos is the census, the flawed census, I should say, the undercount in so many communities, the fact that people, COVID, and the effect that COVID had on reporting. And quite frankly, one of the things that the Progressive Network and the Progressive Caucus is looking at is trying to get the deviation increased. You know, we've had a 5% deviation forever. There is nothing in statute that says it has to be 5%. There is nothing in the Constitution that says it has to be 5%. The percent of the deviation is decided by the members of the General Assembly. And quite frankly, we believe very strongly that we need to be looking at least a 10% deviation to address the fall off, the loss of population in rural South Carolina in particular. And I would point out to you, Shauna, that's not just about Democrats. You've got Republicans who have also lost population and who would be helped by this. And so, you know, I'm always an eternal optimist, keep hope alive. If we, as Senator Fanning has said, shine enough light on it, perhaps these kinds of issues will be raised at these hearings. And who knows, perhaps the Republican leadership might decide that at least some of what we are trying to tell them and some of what we're trying to get them to do makes sense. But even if all of that fails, we've got people now in the General Assembly who are engaged and who will be ready in 2030 when this process starts again. I will not be here, but I feel confident that there are going to be people here at that point who can take what we've learned from all of these other efforts, particularly this effort, since it is unique in how the committee has been selected, the flawed census and all of that. So who knows? We'll wait and see.
And Sean, I think if you talk with some members of the General Assembly, they'll let you know that it's looking more and more, as Representative Cobb-Hunter pointed out, that it could be January before we're approving maps. That we might end up meeting in the House maybe in late October, the Senate in early November to start the process. But it very likely could be January before anything is voted on. And the Senate has 3 years to approve them. I mean, we normally do it with the House, but there's no rush on the Senate's end. So we don't want to let a moment pass when we do have leverage and shining light on a flaw that we could at least codify any rules that maybe our committees are using so the public could know them up front. When I played a game with my son would teach me a new game. I'd want him to tell me the rules before he started the game, because we didn't. My son would say, no, threes are wild. And he didn't bother to tell me that at the beginning of the game. And so he'd always win. And so one of the rules I had with my son when he was teaching me games or making up games is you got to tell me the rules before we start. And that's what this bill does. This bill simply says we need to have the rules in code. It ought to be done by citizen committees. Representative Cobb-Hunter and I introduced that bill several years ago. We couldn't convince our colleagues to give up that power. So if we are going to keep the power and do it ourselves, we at least need to make sure the other people playing the game, meaning the citizens in South Carolina, get to know those rules before the process starts. And hopefully this bill will make us be more transparent over the coming months.
And Shauna, it's important to recognize that we don't have to wait 10 years for another redistricting. There were 4 redistrictings in 1990 when things started popping. And so were we to be able to get the amendment for a Citizens Redistricting Commission on the general election ballot in 2024, we're convinced that the majority of the people would vote for it, and we would change the game, and we would have another redistricting.
Because you have to have redistricting at least once every 10 years, but there's not a max on the number of redistricts that you have. So we haven't had a deadline that would have passed. And hopefully that what we're going through now illustrates the need. Why are politicians doing this rather than independent commissions? Why do we not have the rules that the committees are using in statute and code? And by the way, I think Representative Cobb-Hunter and I we want to point out that we think the staff that works for the House and Senate are phenomenal human beings who are giving their best faith effort. They are not partisan. They're working nonpartisan. They're doing some amazing things. It's just the process being in the hands, going back to my Monopoly thing, asking one of the people playing Monopoly with you to also be the banker. You might not get your $200 when you pass go. So we need an independent banker when we play Monopoly, and we need to know the rules of the Monopoly game before we get started.
You all mentioned the need and the desire to get the attention of leadership, but aside from Republican leadership, what all are you hearing from your other Republican colleagues in the legislature? I mean, just even anecdotally, maybe you don't want to like narc anyone out by name, but what's the conversation on their side like? Do you feel like there is at least support for this kind of a notion, or at least an exploration of doing the process differently? What's that like on the other side?
Well, Meg, your question suggests that we have consensus on the Democratic side. And the reality is that is not the case. So a lot of what we're doing is trying to talk to our own colleagues, try to get Democrats to recognize the need to reform the system. And so my efforts have been mainly focused on Democrats, because that's, I figure, take care of home before you try to do anything else. The reality on the Republican side is that privately, in conversations with a few of them, they have agreed with me that the process sucks, but the problem becomes having the intestinal fortitude to take a vote to change that process. And that's true for both Democrats and Republicans. It's kind of like, you get caught up with the title and the tags. People enjoy this, what they perceive as power. They kind of like these jobs, so they don't want to give them up. And they certainly don't want to make them competitive and have somebody run against them. Quite frankly, it amazes me that people get offended, or they seem to get offended, when people fail to run against them. I think that's the wrong attitude. The seat belongs to the people, not to the politician. And we claim in the system we have in this country that, all is fair. And so let people run if they want to.
And to jump in and talking with my colleagues, safe seats, creating safe seats makes it hard on moderates from either party. If you are a moderate Republican or a moderate Democrat, if you're in a safe Republican or Democratic seat, you're more likely to be primaried because it's a safe seat on one side, in which case you're going to need to move further to the right or to the left. Those folks that like to work across the aisle that tend to be moderate, they are not benefited by the process that creates these safe Republican Democratic seats. And so that's something that some of them have said off the record. I agree with Representative Gilda Cobb-Hunter, my tag team partner here, is that I have just as much disagreement with this bill among my Democratic colleagues as Republican colleagues. I will tell you where I see the difference are folks that have been in the Senate longer than 8 years and people that have been in the Senate less than 8 years. When I talked, I've only been, this is my second term. So when I talk to my colleagues of both parties that have been in the Senate less than 8 years, they're telling me this is the first time they've gone through the process, and they're saying things like, this seems weird. Are we really doing this? And that's all it is. But those that have been there longer than 8 years, it's become a part of the process. It's become a part of what they've done, and it's become accepted. And so to answer your question without giving names, in talking with fellow newer elected officials that this is their first time going through, I found equal numbers of Republicans and Democrats saying, really, this is the system?
And Meg, let me point out that the bill that Senator Fanning and Cobb-Hunter introduced an early filing in 2018 was a legislation that called for the mechanics of a Citizens Redistricting Commission, and they also introduced a joint resolution for an amendment to the Constitution. We do not anticipate the 170 legislators supporting either one of those, but we have them outnumbered. According to the university study, 65% of everybody, which comes up to over 2,015,000 voters, will ultimately prevail over the 170 legislators when we force it onto the ballot. We'll get into those weeds when we were already working on and pretty well down the road to being able to present Fanning and Cobb-Hunter. Will put on the table, their respective tables, what it looks like if you had fair maps. And this is what democracy can and should look like. So we're going to have to show people, because it's beyond comprehension, but we can do this. You may remember that we still haven't passed the Equal Rights Amendment, and the right for women to vote that was passed in 1919, we adopted in 1969. And so things move slowly here, but we've got a ground game that we'll talk about when we introduce the maps.
Let me, if I may, give you an example of what I think is a problem with both safe seats and the fear of being primary. And all of y'all are writing about it, quite frankly, and that's that proviso that the House put in the state budget, which takes away control from both local government as well as local school districts. When you're in a safe seat, when you're in a seat and you're catering to one particular audience, you don't worry too much about the state as a whole. Your focus is on your little district, and not even the entire district, just your base of support. The other part of the mask piece that I'm trying to make the point about is, if you are in a safe district, you are going to go with the flow, and you're pretty much going, and I'm talking Republicans, because that's where the power is, quite frankly. If you are one who has you're pretty independent in your thinking, and it occurs to you that it's ridiculous for the legislature to micromanage local government, the chances of you actually pushing that button to vote no on that power grab is real slim, because if you vote no, you will likely be primary. Now, that may well be put to the test, because one Republican, Deal Blackwell, voted no on the mask mandate. And so it's far afield. It doesn't really have anything to do with redistricting necessarily, but it's a byproduct of gerrymandered districts, of safe districts, and how people operate, not so much in the best interest of South Carolina, but in the best interest of what's going to keep them in the seat. I believe very strongly, Senator Fanning believes very strongly that the state of South Carolina has suffered as a result of these gerrymandered seats. It's even more critical, it's even more prevalent here as opposed to other areas because of the disparity. I mean, the Republicans are in total control and have been in control of one body or the other since 1994. I keep waiting for voters to figure out what's going on here. Why are we last in everything that's good and first in everything that's bad? You know, so there are some questions that voters are going to have to ask. And all Senator Fanning and I are trying to do is bring a little sunshine in so that people will start asking questions. The main thing for me is always ask questions. All people can do is say yes or no or not answer, but it's the squeaky wheel that gets the grease in politics. And what we're trying to do with this legislation is get people to start squeaking, to people who can make a difference, not to each other, but to people who can make a difference.
Yes, who would ask Representative Cobb-Hunter? This is Dion Gleaton from TV.
Hey, Dion.
Hi. How do you think majority minority districts, how do you think they might be affected by this plan?
I think that there are some majority, well, two things, Dion. They are already, some of them are already affected by the loss in population. For example, right here in Orangeburg County, we have had a significant loss in population, so there are going to have to be some real changes to this district. I was in the legislature when most, if not all, of these new minority districts were created. And so there will be a reckoning, shall we say, with having to back up on some of that. But quite frankly, I'm of the opinion that that was not a wise thing to do necessarily, because what it does is it allows politicians to just focus on one little group. I like to think that while I represent a majority Black district, I would like to think that I have a kind of view that is inclusive of all South Carolinians. And so, Dion, to answer your question, there might likely be a loss of some of those districts. I'm not sure, but I believe, quite frankly, that a district that is 55% is more than winnable for a person of color. I have never supported the notion of districts being 65, 70%. Quite the contrary, in the last redistricting that we did, I offered maps, and that's when we got the new congressional district. I offered a map that would have made the 6th district and the 7th district Democratic influence districts. Of course, that didn't go anywhere. The Democrats didn't support it. The Black caucus didn't support it. And so I think what you're going to find is that Black legislators are just like white legislators. They don't want to give up the seats. They don't want to give up what they perceive as power. And so that's why it is critical that the state of South Carolina join the other 49 states and create legislation, a policy, or whatever, guidelines, codify them so that years from now, everybody will know what the rules are, as Senator Fanning has pointed out, and we'll all be playing by the same rules, hopefully.
WCIV was next.
Hi, I'm Sean Mahoney with WCIV in Charleston. The one question I had was, when you guys were drafting this legislation and writing up the specifics of how it'll work, did you get any inspiration? Were you looking at other states or other systems and getting an inspiration from that? And if so, like, kind of where would that come from in terms?
Yes, we were looking at the 49 other states. Sometimes you will find out that a state is doing something right, and Representative Cobb-Hunter and I get excited because we can follow the example set forth by that state. Our research this time showed us we were the emperor with no clothes. We were the only one that didn't have our guidelines codified in law. And so this was one where you don't have one state as an example. you realize you're the only one playing the game that hadn't been doing something that is a part of democracy, is
Yeah.
that the citizens deserve that.
One state you might want to take a look at, not that we necessarily patterned this after, but to see how the independent commission works, is the state of Colorado. We have, it appears that in Colorado, two current Congress people will be running against each other. It'll be interesting to see whether Lauren Boebert and Joe Neguse wind up being drawn in the same district. But the fact that there is even the possibility of that happening shows you the value of an independent commission. In Colorado, they drew lines not based on who is in the seat, but based on things that are in the statute, things that Coloradans have decided are important in drawing lines.
Hey, Julia Kaufman with WLTX here. So if South Carolina doesn't have any codified rules when it comes to the redistricting process, do you all know or are able to share the process or system that we have now that's happening right now and the rules they follow?
Sure, is that each committee that begins its process, they do agree on a set of guidelines that the committee will use in their process. And so I don't want to somehow, and I don't think Representative Cobb-Hunter wants to insinuate that no one's following any rules at all. We just don't have them codified in law for the public to then judge and determine whether they're good rules or not. And so, for example, in the Senate, we do have a Senate subcommittee of the Judiciary Committee that has established a set of rules and guidelines that states that we will try to keep communities of interest together. We will try to avoid gerrymandering, meaning drawing lines only to elect re-elect a certain person. There's some guidelines like that in place, but they're not as specific, let's say, as other states might have. They certainly aren't in law because those guidelines could certainly change as new information becomes available. They are again just guidelines that a committee has said we're going to start by looking at where current senators live, what the communities surrounding those current Senate districts are, and are there ways to keep them together or not together. Those types of, just to give you some examples of guidelines, are what they're using at this point in the process. Julia, does that help?
It does, thank you.
Representative Cobb-Hunter, speak to, do you need to leave now?
I got 2 minutes.
Speak to Julia's question about House rules, guidelines within the House and the protection of who it protects.
Yeah, pretty much the same as what Senator Fanning has said, Julia. The House does have guidelines that the subcommittee has adopted. The problem with those guidelines, quite frankly, is the inability to provide input into those guidelines. So there are guidelines, and as he pointed out, we certainly don't want to suggest that it's all willy-nilly and there's no method to the madness, because there is. But we just think it's important that the guidelines be such that they aren't changed every 10 years, like I mentioned to y'all starting out, how we've got a different subcommittee. And on the face of it, that may not seem like a big deal. But when you think about redistricting and when you think about the makeup of that committee and the fact that they have zero experience, or the majority of them have zero experience at it, to me suggests that they are able to, and I don't want to say to be manipulated, but it suggests that they may be able to not necessarily put the kind of weight on in certain areas that if there were guidelines we think should be
there. And one just other thing to pop it, because I know folks are getting ready to have to pop off. At some point, we just need to step back and realize we don't need to make this too complicated. 71% of the voters have no choice when they go vote in an election. 71% of South Carolina voters have only one choice, which is not a choice, one name on the ballot when they go to vote for an election. That ain't right. That ain't democracy. That's not the people having the power to turn our state around. And so we've got to do something, whether it's the independent redistricting committee that Representative Cobb-Hunter and I have introduced in legislation a couple years ago, whether it's just refining the rules and putting the rules in permanent law for the citizens to be able to hold us accountable to the process, shining light on the process. We need to do something differently, because we can't continue down a road where we claim to be a democracy and 71% of our citizens have no choice on a general election ballot of who represents them. Something needs to change. This bill at least offers a reasonable, we think very reasonable, a very small baby steps towards that process changing, ensuring that the citizens at least see the light shine where it's not supposed to be, that we put our rules into writing, that we engage them in that process, putting their participation in law and in statute, hopefully getting that change.
Well, we need to let Representative Cobb-Hunter on to other business that she has obligations for. But
Thanks,
to thank her,
everybody. Appreciate it.
thank you for your visionary and bold leadership, Representative.
Thank you and Becky for y'all's years of consistent work.
Thank
Bye,
you.
Mike. Be safe, everybody.
Bye-bye.
And Mike, can you stay for more
Sure can.
questions? Yes. So anybody that hadn't asked a question, ask a question. And if not, we'll go home.
My goats are fine. We've had some baby goats born this summer, and they're doing well. Most of you had texted me that question and didn't want to ask it in front of everyone, so I did want you to know that they are doing well.
Want to thank everybody for coming, and feel free to email the network address that you have in your invitation for questions, and we will get you answers and provide documentation for whatever you need. And this is a slow dance. It's not like a foxtrot here, but we do have plans to actually force the legislature to let the people vote on this, which you can find at fairmapssc.com. We will be introducing it. Senator Fanning and Gilda Cobb-Hunter will be introducing maps that we've drawn up that follow the legislative outline that you'll see in the Citizens Redistricting Commission Act, which is also listed with a link at the fairmapssc.com. And it's a hard ground game. So is democracy. And so we believe that people can prevail. We can't wait on the courts, obviously. And one of the questions that was asked about protection of incumbency, the House actually has a rule or a guideline for protection of incumbency, and the Senate certainly can do the same. But what we know from watching the Supreme Court and dealing with Section 5 for years, I've been dealing with Section 5 at the Department of Justice, Civil Rights Division, Voting Rights Section, South Carolina desk, being told that it's not the federal government's responsibility how states run their elections. And if you remember, when the Constitution was written, there was a guy named King George that was a real threat to people. And so they didn't want a strong federal government running state elections. And so when I would complain that political gerrymandering is up to the local people to vote the politicians out, and when I would point out that it's so rigged by race that you can't get the political weight to be able to change it, their response, they being the Section 5 desk at the Justice Department, was, that's your problem. And so it's our problem. It's on the people's desk. And with Mike Fanning's Goats and Donkey leading the way,
That's right.
Trust that this will happen before 2040 or 30 or whenever the next decade starts. So if there are no more questions, we do appreciate your participation.
Thank you, Brett, Becky, and the entire Progressive Network that has really carried this.
And Vince Matthews, who's with us listening.
Vince has done amazing research on this. Absolutely.
Indeed. And so thank you all for coming, and stay tuned and don't hesitate to ask questions. Thank you, Mike.
Thank you all.